Today's episode of Locked On MLB is brought to you by Ultimate Baseball GM. Have you ever dreamed about being a baseball general manager and managing your own baseball franchise? Then this game is definitely for you. To download the game, just visit ultimatebaseballgm.com or look it up on the App Store. Our listeners get a 100% free boost to the franchise when using the promo code Locked On, all caps in the game. Now, let's start the podcast. It's Locked On MLB.
You are Locked On MLB, your daily MLB podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, baseball fans. Welcome to Locked On MLB, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. This is the daily podcast. We talk about all of Major League Baseball. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. There's my lower third. You can call me Sully. I am an Emmy-nominated television producer who has been a baseball podcaster for well over the last decade, and now I am beginning my fifth full season as a podcaster here on the Locked On Podcast Network. You can follow our show at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter and on Instagram. You can follow me. I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We are looking to get 1 billion subscribers. We're several hundred million short. And be sure to tell your smart device to play podcast Locked On MLB or check out some of the other great shows on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, including Locked On Mariners, Locked On Yankees. You name the team, we've got it. Well, I'm very, very happy to have our guest on the show. He is an author of a wonderful book called, right here, it's on my Kindle. Oops, it's on my Kindle, The Voices of Baseball. Trust me, it's on my Kindle. And he's a brand new edition of the book coming out. I'm thrilled that he's going to be part of the show. Kirk McKnight, where are you? Oh, let me switch this. We're on the wrong side. There we go. Kirk McKnight, how are you doing on this evening?
I'm great. I thought you were starting to say, "Where are you?" And I could say I'm out of Wickenburg, Arizona. So spring training's only 20 miles down the road from me.
Which spring training site is nearby you?
The Surprise in Cactus League.
All right, cool.
Surprise, Arizona. That's the home of the Rangers and the Royals.
Let me just ask you before we jump into the book, which team did you grow up listening to, and which narrator of baseball did you grow up with?
Well, so radio, it was Scully with the Dodgers because I'm from Las Vegas.
Right.
But on TV, I had the good fortune of being able to watch TBS Braves broadcast with Pete Van Wieren, Ernie Johnson Sr., and and Skip Carey. So we have a very generational thing going here. You know, I've gotten to know Skip's son Chip, and I've gotten to know Ernie Johnson Sr.'s son, Ernie Johnson Jr., who does a great job, and so also on WGN. So I got to, you know, I basically got the Careys, grandfather and son, basically, with Harry on WGN, and then with Skip on TBS. So you could say I was brought up by the Careys.
I'm a native New Englander, and so I grew up with Ned Martin in Boston. I adored Ned Martin's voice way back, and Mercy. And but I also had Ken Coleman. I was never the biggest Ken Coleman fan. I know I was supposed to love Ken Coleman because he did it for 7 quadrillion years. But Joe, I was also there at the beginning of Joe Castiglione is wonderful. And then when we went to visit my grandparents who lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, we would get the Yankees and the Mets. And my mother grew up a very big Yankee fan and an Italian family. And so having Phil Rizzuto announcing those games was this great connection I had with my mom. And right to the point when I was at NYU, I would kind of, when I knew there'd be a game on Channel 11, I would make sure I was available to listen to it because I just loved, you know, Phil Rizzuto was like your wacky Italian uncle who you're watching the game with. He was not going to give you great insight in terms of color commentary, but it was going to be fun as hell to listen to it. But that's part of, It's like what Vince Scully used to say, if you're just joining us, pull up a chair. It's like the best announcers kind of become like a friend in some way, that they're your companion. It's beyond simply just describing the action, but it's the person you're going to watch the games with, and that's why I have no problem if an announcer's a homer. I have no announcer no problem if an announcer puts their thumbprint all over it. So and we were all blessed too that we were able to get like the super stations like WOR and TBS and WGN across the country.
And that's it. I mean, I'm wearing a White Sox hat and a White Sox T-shirt. That doesn't necessarily mean they're my favorite team, but I definitely love the White Sox input in the updated edition of the book, because now I got Steve Stone. Len Casper went from the north side to the south side, so I
Right.
got him for some Cubs stuff when the first edition came around, and now I've got him for some White Sox stuff, including the Field of Dreams game.
By the way, Jason Benetti, who is one of the new announcers, I think is fantastic. I think he's one of the best new young announcers in the game. I think he's funny. I think he's insightful, and I think that he is just and kind of straddles that line of being a fan and enjoying it, having fun. Understand it's a game, but also not trying to be a wacky character either. I think that he's really. I hope he's going to be their announcer for many years to come.
And he's over there with, you said, where did you say Joe Benetti's at again?
Well, he's the new TV announcer for the White Sox, and I think that he does a great job for them. We lost Ed Farmer recently. I always thought Ed Farmer was really grumpy. Everything was always the glass wasn't half full. There was no glass with Ed Farmer. I could picture him in 05 going, "Yeah, we won the World Series, but why did it take so long?" He was a little bit of a grump. But let's get to the book. Why don't you describe for not everyone has it on their Kindle. Why don't you describe a little bit of what the book is about and how you began this project?
Well, the book originally was intended to basically be a tour through all the ballparks of baseball, courtesy of the broadcasters. No ballpark has the same dimensions. Baseball is the only sport that is not uniform. It's very universal. And so that was my stepping off point, and basically getting the broadcasters to talk about the uniqueness of their ballparks. But, as time goes on, you start to realize you can't just basically designate just the home stuff. The Cubs won the first World Series in 108 years on Cleveland's, turf.
Right.
There's no way I can't include Pat Hughes being the first broadcaster to call a Cubs World Series championship in the book, just because it happened in Cleveland. It's just not going to happen. So, and luckily I was able to talk with Tom Hamilton, the longtime announcer of the Indians Guardians, and he gave his spiel on the game, from Progressive Field. So that was a home game for him in Game 7. But yeah, so the newer edition, you'll start to see that we've kind of gone away from necessarily talking about home game as to, calling just the more historic moments. Like, for example, one of the last interviews, in fact, maybe the last interview I did for new material, was with Jesse Agler from the San Diego Padres. You see, he called the first San Diego no-hitter in history, and he was calling that game from Petco Park, even though it was taking place in Globe Life Field in Texas. He was calling it in the visiting TV booth at Petco Park and doing it all via monitor, because this is COVID was still a thing. Broadcasters were not traveling for road games. So, it kind of felt like Nat Albright, who used to sit there and produce games in his own basement and recreate games and do all things like that. It almost seemed like that when you hear in the story of Jesse and Tony Gwynn Jr. calling that game of Joe Musgrove's no-hitter. So it's that you have your give and take of the most memorable moments, but you also see how these broadcasters created the atmosphere. I mean, that's perfect for this book, is to have that, because the people who were tuned into radio obviously didn't, they weren't in the booth with the guys, and they didn't have a visual. Well, the guys didn't have a live visual themselves.
Right.
But they were able to do their job and call the game and give us walkthrough of the first no-hitters of Padres history.
Okay, let's take a minute to talk about Ultimate Baseball GM. Now, look, my mom is listening to the show, and she knows that I have been creating my own fantasy baseball teams my whole life. I've had teams since I was a kid. I had teams, I kept score when I played video games, and I was always the general manager, always in control of my teams that I created. And now you could do it on your phone. I've been doing it. I am the general manager of the Honolulu Waves. That's my team that I have on this app, and I'm in control of all aspects of it. Now, guess what? I can do things. I can hire the coaches. I can draft and scout players. I can navigate my franchise through free agency and the ups and downs of the season, and I'm in charge. Go Hawaii, the Honolulu Waves. Sorry, I forgot the name of my own team. This is all a challenging and realistic game right there on your phone. I got it downloaded right over there. Phone's charging. Forgive me. Ultimate Baseball GM is completely free, playable offline, play on the go, play whatever you want and when you want to. And it is so deep and intricate and gets into every aspect of running a baseball team. And let me tell you something. If you're like me, I've been thinking about this ever since I was 7 or 8 years old. And I feel like a kid again playing this game. So here's what you got to do. Locked On MLB listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise. Go Honolulu Waves when using the promo Locked On in the game store. So check it out. To download the game, just visit probaseballgm.com, scan the code, or look it up at the App Store. That's probaseballgm.com. Ultimate Baseball GM. Start your dynasty today. Who knows? Maybe we'll have Locked On Honolulu Waves as a podcast. Yeah, I mentioned this on a previous show, and I'll share it with you. During the COVID year, when they had the cutouts and every stadium became the album cover of Sergeant Pepper, and I found it really unnerving to watch those games because I watched baseball as kind of an escape. Especially we all, I don't care what your faith, politics, whatever it was, everyone was having a rough year in 2020. Everyone needed an escape. And I didn't like seeing the empty stadiums and the cardboard cutouts because it almost reminded me of everything that was happening. And certainly by the time we got to the postseason, it was really weird. Like they were playing the ALCS in San Diego. They were playing the NLCS in Houston and at the new ballpark in Arlington. And everything just felt slightly weird. So I think I watched 2 games that postseason, but I listened to every one of them.
Right.
I listened to them because when it was Tampa versus Houston in the ALCS, when it was Atlanta versus Los Angeles in the NLCS, I was closing my eyes and imagining Dodger Stadium. I was closing my eyes and, believe it or not, imagining the Trop. And it almost is weird watching the highlights of those World Series because it's like, wait, that's not where it was. That's not where it took place. And I was having a wonderful time because they sweetened it with some, crowd sounds and everything like that in the radio, which I'm fine with. I'm fine with a laugh track, in the right place. And that year made me really fall back in love with the radio broadcast. I've always loved the radio broadcast, but like even the last year or so, I've preferred to listen. And it's weird, like me, my wife's saying, like, don't you want to watch the game? I'm listening to it. I'm listening. And I've really enjoyed, it's a game designed for the radio. That's one of the reasons why baseball was at the peak of its power when the 2 chief forms of media were the daily and, the editions of the newspapers where they could tell the story and the narrative, and the radio broadcaster telling the story and becoming your companion to the game. And oh my goodness, it was such a wonderful way to sort of just get wrapped back up in the radio broadcasts.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's skewed more to radio as far as the representation in the book. But me having included more of the national announcers like Joe Buck and Bob Costas in this edition and the paperback edition, you do have the TV going on here a little bit. So I don't think it's necessarily divided down the middle, but I think there's definitely a fair representation of TV, but very much a fair representation of radio. Some of the, most of the Hall of Famers are all radio broadcasters, but I
Right.
still had a handful of, out of the 11, I'm not sure breaking it down, but I'd say that probably 3, 4 of them are TV broadcasters, maybe even more, and the rest of them were radio. And, and that's not to take away from a TV broadcast,
No.
but a lot of the criticisms that people gave me about the voice of baseball is they felt there wasn't enough radio. And I'm thinking, it's all radio. If you look at the list of broadcasters, you just got to sit there and look it up, because how else am I going to get those World Series moments
Right.
without the radio, because the TV broadcasters, they're not broadcasting the playoffs. Rex Hudler talking about the 2002 Angels, he's talking about it as a fan.
Right.
And the same with the 2015 Royals. He's talking about it as a fan. But you got Ryan Lefevre from the Royals as a radio broadcaster and Denny Matthews in the booth together. And you're talking about, Ryan sitting there talking about it as a broadcaster and the experience. So without the radio, I'm not going to have that kind of representation for these magical moments in the postseason.
Yeah, I was thinking about, my two team, like my grew up a huge Red Sox fan as a native New Englander, and of course, the biggest moments, like when I think about the biggest games in the history of the Red Sox, both positive and negatively in my lifetime, like the four of the biggest ones were road games. The Dave Henderson home run was in Anaheim. Game 6 of the '86 World Series was in New York. The bloody sock A-Rod slapping the ball, which I was in attendance of that game in New York. That was at Yankee Stadium. And of course, winning the World Series that was in St. Louis. Obviously there are other huge moments, the Dave Roberts steal, or another negative, would be, the Boone home run, but like you'd have obviously you have the cop jumping up and down, and you have a couple other big moments like that, but so many of them, they've won 4 World Series this century, and 3 of them were clinched on the road.
Right.
That's kind of the road moments are sometimes some of the more interesting ones, like some of the great moments in baseball history. I mean, in recent years, you brought up the Royals, Bumgarner coming out pitching the final 5 innings of that World Series. That was on the road in Kansas City. I hate calling it the Bartman game, because it wasn't Bartman's fault. It's ridiculous. But Game 6 of that NLCS, let's call it the Alex Gonzalez game, which is what it should be called. That massive collapse. Well, I bet most people can't tell you who won that game. Most people remember that as the Cubs losing. I think most people forgot that was Florida. Florida won that game.
Yeah.
But and it's like the way that radio announcers can connect with their fans, but TV announcers as well. I don't want to discount that. I had mentioned Phil Rizzuto, who became this great connection between me and my mom and my grandfather for all those years when he was the PIX announcer. By the way, just tangentially, some of the most fun years to listen to Rizzuto was when he was paired with Tom Seaver in the late '80s, early '90s, because the Yankees were terrible. So there was always reason for Rizzuto to go off on some tangent about cannolis or some golf course in Teaneck, New Jersey, and Tom Seaver knew how to push his buttons, and it was just very funny, especially as this was the Mel Hall, Jesse Barfield, Kevin Moss years for the Yankees. But it's funny, like my dad, my late father's team was the San Francisco Giants. And towards the end of and he never missed a game, whether it was on the radio or TV. But towards the end of his life, he wouldn't even refer to, I'm going to watch the Giants game. He said, I'm going to watch Kruk and Kite. Put on Kruk and Kite. I want to watch Kruk and Kite. And my dad just loved Kruko, loved Kuiper, and loved Fleming, and loved John Miller. But it was so like, put on Kruk and Kite, put on Kruk and Kite, because it was, they were like his friends. He felt like he knew them, watching the games.
I think that's another thing to think about. And I keep, John Miller said, I think it was Dave Kuiper that said, following the Giants, especially when they're starting to win, he says, Giants baseball, it's torture.
Oh yeah.
And those kinds of those turns of phrases, you think about those, and those are generally initiated on a TV broadcast
Hmm.
because you have your audience, you have your locals who are watching these games every day of the year, and so you have some of those little uh, turn of phrases like that where the TV crowd gets it and stuff like that. I said something about with the Royals, the TV audience following them and all their success. They did a thing, their thing in the 2015 was 2 claps and a Ric Flair. And when you're around in Kansas City, my nephew flew from Kansas City to Vegas. This was like in 2021, so this is like 5 or 6 years after they won the World Series. They arrive and the plane lands, and the people are like, well, we've landed in Vegas. About 5 or 6 people in the airplane do that, woo. So it carries on, and I think a lot of those things are generated with the TV relationship with the audience there locally. Of course, not to take away from the radio, of course they have their own relationships as well, but I see that some of these things like Giants baseball, it's torture. It made me think of that when you mentioned Kuiper and Kruko.
Right. I think John Miller's one of the great announcers of all time. It's funny, he was an announcer a few years with the Red Sox in the early 80s. But then he started kind of being he was in Baltimore for a long time. He was actually, as a very young man, he was hired by Charlie Finley
Yeah.
when they was announcing the A's in the mid 70s. I think his pairing with Joe Morgan, I think he had so many great calls. Um, he has there's some wonderful calls he did. It's funny, like there's some specific ones. Like I remember he was the ESPN announcer when Seattle and the then California Angels played a one-game playoff to win for the Western Division in '95, and the final score was like 9-1. So if you glanced at it, you say, "Oh, it was a blowout," but it was a 1-0 game until like the seventh or eighth inning. It was a tight matchup between Mark Langston and Randy Johnson, who ironically Langston used to be a star for the Mariners, and he was traded, and they got Randy Johnson. So there were great storylines going on there. And the big moment, the bases were loaded, and Luis Sojo, who later became a Yankee hero, hit a liner down the right field line that cleared the bases, and the throw home was wild, and Soho scored. So it was essentially an inside the park grand slam. It was a double. He scored on the error, but it's the same as an inside the park grand slam. It just opened the game open. The reason I'm bringing that up is if you ever find that game with John Miller's call, it's one of my favorite calls because it just kept building. It said, "It's fair. Blowers has scored. Tito Martinez has scored. They all have scored. And here comes Soho. Safe." And if you're listening, because he's the TV announcer, so he doesn't have to describe every nuance. He just has to, he like hits the bullet points. And the result was hitting the bullet points, but raising the drama with each bullet point. And if anyone ever finds that, I must be on YouTube. I think this conversation we're having right now is on YouTube. But if you ever find that, to me, if I ever taught a class on broadcasting, said, "Here's great television broadcasting," he knows he doesn't have to say, describe everything, and he knows his radio, but that's a perfect example, in my opinion, of adapting to, if you're going to do TV, this is how you do it. If he did on the radio, it would of course he would have to describe every little thing that was happening.
Yeah, I mean, John Miller is all over the Voices of Baseball because he basically represented for the majority of the Baltimore chapter.
Hmm.
Because I mean, like we were talking about, the theme of it was ballpark uniqueness, and Camden Yards is the one that broke the mold. It broke the cookie cutter mold that we saw in all those multi-use facilities through the 70s and 80s, and everything looking the same. Camden Yards is one that broke it, and what better way, within 2 or 3 years, you got Cal Ripken Jr. chasing and passing Lou Gehrig. So John Miller was there for all those moments, and he was there for so many moments. Just think of how fortuitous his career was being there during that dynasty in Oakland, being there for a championship in Baltimore, and then having 3 championships in San Francisco.
Yeah, and of course the White Sox missed it by this much that they opened up what is now called, was it Guaranteed Rate Field?
I still
Just
call it Comiskey.
yeah, well, I was there the first year when it was the new Comiskey, and then I mean, look, it's not a terrible stadium. It's just they had a chance to have Camden Yards, and they just missed it. They just missed out.
I mean, the truth of it all is it's been named so many times, and they just can't wait to cut that check for the naming rights so they can go back and do something to the ballpark that they should have done the first time around.
Yep.
They've spent over 200 million, or I don't know, I'm not sure if it's 200 million. They've spent in the 9 digits redoing and renovating and trying to make up for the hasty way in which they built it in the first place, because they were in a race trying to beat Camden Yards. They pretty much, I think Camden Yards was even announced before the
Yeah.
White Sox announced, new Comiskey. And so they were getting out there and getting it out. And there was immediate regret. Once Camden Yards opened, there was immediate regret in Chicago. They were like, why didn't we do it this way?
Yeah. Okay, let's take a minute to talk about FanDuel. Guess what? It's right around the corner. We've got March Madness is beginning. The NCAA tournament is going to be on full swing. And before you know it, it'll be time for the NBA playoffs. It'll be time for the Stanley Cup playoffs. So many great sports are going on here, and it's a perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sports book, because customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if the first bet doesn't win. Download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe, secure, super easy to use. Then you can bet on anything from the money line to point scores to threes drained. Plus, FanDuel lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. So don't miss out on your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the National Basketball Association. We're here with Kirk McKnight, author of The Voice of Baseball. New edition is coming out in April. Am I correct? Am I correct
Yes.
on that?
Yes, April 12th, April 13th.
I've been working on my baseball book. Here's one of the many notebooks that I've filled up with notes and everything about the 1972 postseason. And along the way, I've been going on these deep dives of old ball games and listening to, and that particular series, and hearing Monty Moore, hearing Kirk Gowdy, hearing Al Michaels, because what I always liked what NBC did for a period of time. They would have Kirk Gowdy or Joe Garagiola or Tony Kubek matched with the announcer of the home team, and then the radio would have the announcer of the visiting team, and then they would switch. And so you would have Monty Moore, who was the voice of the A's forever, doing as one of the voices for the games when they're in Oakland. But Al Michaels, who at the time was one of the voices of the Cincinnati Reds, would be announcing when they're in Cincinnati. And that's why you had Dick Stockton was one of the announcers in the 1975 World Series, or Phil Rizzuto was one of the announcers in the 1976 World Series. I like that. I like having, one of the home announcers involved in the TV broadcast. It just seems unfair that you shut them out during one of the, the brightest moment.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. That's a good dynamic to create there.
By the way, I have to say, going through some of these games, listen to some of the announcers, I'm going to say something that's sacrilegious, okay? Especially, because I'm cutting together the new In Memoriam video that I do every year, and Vin Scully is prominently placed in. Vin Scully is one of the great voices and one of the great talents and everything like that. And when he died several months ago, I had more than one person ask me, was he the greatest announcer of all time? And I said, when he was in the booth with Joe, when he did the games with Joe Garagiola, he wasn't the greatest announcer in the booth. And that sounds like I'm crapping on Vin Scully. I'm not. I think Joe Garagiola, he is my favorite baseball announcer of all time. He has the greatest voice. He has the chops of being a player. He has the humor. He has the drama, and he also allows the whoever he's announcing with to have their strengths play. That he doesn't overbear him the way Howard Cosell. If you've ever listened to his call of poor Keith Jackson's trying to call Chris Chambliss's pennant-winning homer, and Howard Cosell just talks right over him, like just throws an elbow. And when Garagiola announced the Phillies finally winning their first ever World Series, and he says the crowd will tell you what happens, and he doesn't say a word when the crowd goes crazy and Tug McGraw jumps up with his arms in the air. And I'm thinking the discipline to let the drama play out and not sort of put a stamp on that is wonderful. I will just tell you, Kirk McKnight, there is a game that he announced with Don Sutton, and I believe it was Tony Kubek, and it was game 1 of the playoffs, the NLCS in '79 between Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. And it might be my favorite announced game of all time. The three of them are on top of their game. The game is good. The humor is there. The analysis is wonderful. And to me, that would be like if I'm teaching a class of broadcast, it's like, watch how they do this. Listen to how they do this. Listen to how they'll go to a tape package, but then they'll play to the point of the game. And Garagiola has one of my favorite calls, which was Willie Stargell hit a go-ahead home run in the 11th or 12th inning. And he said, this is gone, and these fans are leaving this ballpark like it's on fire. Which is just, this great description. So I'm a huge Garagiola fan. And I just think he was just he was the greatest in my opinion.
Well, where I am here in Arizona, they love him because his son was a general manager of the Diamondbacks.
That's right.
So,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
so I mean, they have a longing for him. When I was first signing the books back in 2016 around here, they were like, "Is there anything on Garagiola?" And I was like, "Yes, yes, there is. Don't worry."
Well, there should be.
And he had just barely passed away at that time too. So of course there was a yearning for him in that moment too. Just the fact that he just recently passed, sort of like there is right now with the passing of Scully, and that's one of the main things that's new in the book of the Voices of Baseball in the new edition is the tribute that the broadcasters. Basically, I put together the broadcasters' tribute to Scully.
Right. Yeah. Well, look, and by the way, that wasn't me trashing Vin Scully at all. I mean, Vin Scully was obviously, a remarkable broadcaster. I just, I don't want us to shortchange the brilliance of Garagiola, who is my
Right.
favorite. Well, look, Kirk McKnight, I've taken up a bunch of your time. I really want to thank you. Is there anything else you want us to know about you or your writings or your books, or where we could find you, and so people can become a fan of what you're doing?
Well, you can find me on. You see my Twitter tag on there, my handle, and you can get the book on Roman.com. That's Roman with a W. I posted in the chat the discount code to get 30% off the book. It's Roger, Larry, Frank, Andy, Nancy, Drew, Frank, 30. There we go. RLFANDF 30, and you get 30% off the book by ordering it with that discount code, and that makes it about $11 cheaper than Amazon. And then, hey, if you feel more comfortable getting it on Amazon, there you can get it there too. I'm just trying to save you a buck.
There you go.
$11.
Yeah, save $11 there. We'll look at it. It's well worth it, especially if you're a fan of baseball and baseball history, like I know, and a lot of the fans here at Locked On MLB are. Hey, Kirk McKnight, thanks so much for being part of the show and chat with me here. Again, make sure to follow Kirk at the Voices of MLB on Twitter. As for us, you can follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter and on Instagram. I am your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. Talking about the voices of baseball with the author of the book, Kirk McKnight. This has been Locked On MLB. I am your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully.